The fluorescent lights of Intensive Care Unit 4B didn't flicker. They hummed with a low, sickening vibration that seemed to vibrate directly inside your skull. On paper, Ward 4B did not exist. It was an off-limits annex at the very end of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, accessible only by a heavy metal door that required a biometric scan and a 6-digit passcode. The hospital board believed it was a specialized quarantine unit for rare neurological disorders, managed exclusively by the renowned and soft-spoken Dr. Jonathan Vance. To the rest of the medical staff, Dr. Vance was a godsend, a dedicated, brilliant mind who took on the terminal, hopeless cases that no one else dared to touch. But to the silent figures lying in the specialized pressure beds inside Ward 4B, Dr. Vance was something far worse than a monster. He was a creator. Night shift in 4B was quiet, almost dead. There were no alarms, no beeping heart monitors, and no frantic nurses rushing through the hallways. Dr. Vance preferred working alone. On this particular Thursday night, his focus was on bed 3. The patient was Samuel, a 32-year-old high school teacher who had been admitted 3 days prior, following a minor car accident. Samuel had walked into the emergency room with nothing more than a mild concussion and a cracked rib, but he had made the fatal mistake of having no immediate family, no wife, and no emergency contacts listed on his chart. He was invisible to the outside world, making him the perfect canvas for Dr. Vance's masterpiece. Samuel wasn't asleep, though anyone looking through the small observation window would have assumed he was in a deep, peaceful coma. His eyes were half open, staring glassily at the sterile white ceiling tiles above him. Inside his body, however, every single nerve ending was screaming. Samuel was suffering under the effects of Dr. Vance's personal creation, a synthetic chemical compound he called Compound X7. It was an advanced neurological paralytic derived from deep-sea viperfish venom, mixed with localized anesthetic blocking agents. The drug severed the connection between the brain and the motor muscles completely. Samuel couldn't blink. He couldn't twitch a finger. He couldn't even expand his lungs on his own. A mechanical ventilator did the breathing for him, forcing cold artificial air down his throat with a rhythmic mechanical hiss. Yet Compound X7 left the sensory nervous system entirely intact, and in fact hypersensitized. Samuel could hear the soft squeak of Dr. Vance's rubber-soled shoes against the linoleum floor. He could smell the overpowering stench of iodine, bleach, and something raw and metallic, like open meat left out in the sun. Most terrifyingly of all, Samuel could feel everything, every touch, every drop in room temperature, and every slice of the steel scalpel was registered by his brain in agonizing, sharp detail, but his vocal cords were frozen shut. He was trapped inside a living coffin of his own paralyzed skin, incapable of producing even a whisper of a scream. Dr. Vance pulled up a stainless steel rolling tray to the side of Samuel's bed. He carefully arranged his tools with meticulous precision: silver retractors, bone saws, cauterizers, and curved surgical needles threaded with heavy black nylon. But sitting in the center of the tray was something that didn't belong in any hospital room in the world. It was a heavy glass aquarium filled with a thick, murky, ice-cold saline solution. Bubbles rose slowly from an air stone at the bottom of the glass. Inside the dark water, several dark, pale, worm-like organisms curled and squirmed against one another. They were deep-sea parasitic organisms, dredged from the abyssal trenches of the ocean floor, adapted to survive in pitch-black environments with zero oxygen and extreme pressure. Dr. Vance had spent years selective breeding them in his basement laboratory, modifying their genetics so they could thrive inside human body cavities, feeding on warm blood and living internal tissue. Dr. Vance leaned over Samuel, his face framed by the harsh white glow of the overhead surgical light. His blue eyes behind his thin, rimless glasses were warm, polite, almost loving. He adjusted a surgical mask, pulled on a pair of tight black latex gloves, and smoothed down Samuel's messy brown hair with a fatherly tenderness that made Samuel's soul shrink in pure terror. Dr. Vance spoke in a calm, soothing voice, the kind of voice a pediatrician uses to comfort a frightened child before giving them a flu shot. He told Samuel that the world outside was full of chaos and pain. But here, in Ward 4B, they were going to achieve something immortal. He explained that human organs were weak, prone to failure, disease, and decay. But symbiotic life could turn a fragile body into a permanent ecosystem. Samuel wanted to scream, to kick, to bite off his own tongue, just to drown in his own blood and end the nightmare. But his body remained utterly motionless. A motionless slab of meat resting on cold plastic sheets. Dr. Vance uncapped a bottle of yellow betadine antiseptic and poured it directly over Samuel's bare abdomen. The liquid was freezing cold against Samuel's sensitized skin, sending a violent wave of shock through his nervous system. Though his heart monitor, which Vance had modified to display fake, steady vitals to the central hospital network, continued to display a calm 60 beats per minute. Vance picked up the scalpel. The steel blade glinted sharply under the intense lights. Without hesitation, he pressed the tip of the blade in the middle of Samuel's abdomen, right below the rib cage, and drew a long, straight line down toward his navel. The pain was immediate, sharp, and blindingly intense. It felt as if a line of liquid fire was being drawn slowly across Samuel's flesh. Samuel's brain short-circuited with agony, trying frantically to send signals to his arms to fight back, to his legs to kick the tray over, to his vocal cords to let out a primal shriek for help. But nothing moved. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, glassy and unblinking, while tears gathered in the corners of his eyelids and rolled slowly down his temples into his ears. Vance paid no attention to the tears. He used metal retractors to pull the layers of skin, fat, and muscle apart, clamping them into place to expose the dark red interior of Samuel's abdominal cavity. Samuel could feel the cold, sterile air of the room blowing directly onto his exposed guts. The sensation was horrifying beyond comprehension. The feeling of being open, exposed, and vulnerable while fully conscious. Vance worked efficiently, using gauze to swab away the blood. His movements as relaxed and precise as a woodworker carving a piece of oak. He located Samuel's left kidney, carefully clamping the blood vessels around it, and cut the organ free. Samuel felt a deep, sickening pulling sensation inside his stomach, followed by a dull, throbbing vacuum where a part of his body had existed just moments prior. Vance lifted the warm, dark organ out of Samuel's body and casually dropped it into a biohazard bucket near his feet with a wet splat. Then came the true nightmare. Vance turned his attention to the glass aquarium on the rolling tray. He reached inside with long, curved metal forceps and pinched one of the pale, writhing deep-sea parasites near its head. The creature was about 8 inches long, thick as a human thumb, with a translucent, milky white body through which dark, black veins could be seen pulsing. Its mouth was a circular ring of hundreds of microscopic, backward-curving teeth made of cartilage. As Vance pulled the creature out of the ice-cold water into the warm air, it writhed violently, flexing its muscular body back and forth in search of food and warmth. Vance held the squirming parasite directly above Samuel's open stomach. He smiled gently, looking into Samuel's wide, terrified eyes. He whispered that the organism was hungry, that it had been kept in a state of starvation for 3 days, and that it was looking for a new home to settle in. Vance lowered the forceps, placing the icy, writhing parasite directly into the warm cavity where Samuel's left kidney used to be. The moment the organism touched the warm, blood-filled interior of Samuel's body, it reacted with wild, ravenous fury. Samuel felt a shock of pure, unfathomable cold deep inside his core, followed immediately by an agonizing, tearing sensation as the parasite bit directly into his internal artery walls. The creature didn't just sit there, it began to burrow. Samuel could feel every millimeter of its smooth, cold, slimy body squirming through his insides, pushing past his liver, wrapping its long tail around his intestines, and sinking its microscopic teeth deep into his warm tissue to anchor itself in place. The parasite was breathing, expanding and contracting inside Samuel's torso, drawing blood from his vessels to feed its own strange alien biology. The feeling of something foreign, alive, and hungry, moving inside his own abdomen, While he lay paralyzed and helpless was a psychological terror so extreme that Samuel felt his sanity fragmenting into tiny, sharp pieces. Dr. Vance set the forceps down and reached for his needle and thread. He began to sew Samuel's abdominal wall back together, pulling the thick black thread tight with quick, practiced tugs. With every stitch, Samuel felt the parasite inside him panic at the loss of outside light, squirming harder, pushing its blunt head against the inside of his freshly stitched abdominal wall. Samuel could actually see his own skin bulging slightly from the inside as the monster moved within him, searching for a way out, burrowing deeper into his guts to create a permanent nest. Vance finished the final stitch, wiped the dried blood from Samuel's stomach with a warm cloth, and placed a clean white bandage over the wound. He picked up his stethoscope, suspended the metal disc around his neck, and placed the cold diaphragm directly over the bandage on Samuel's belly. Vance closed his eyes, listening intently for several long seconds. A look of pure, ecstatic satisfaction washed over the doctor's face. He leaned down close to Samuel's ear, his cold breath brushing against Samuel's cheek. Vance whispered that the heart rate of the parasite had synchronized with Samuel's own pulse, meaning the body had accepted the host. He told Samuel that he was no longer just a man, but an incubator for something far grander, and that over the next few weeks, as the parasite laid its eggs inside his lower digestive tract, Samuel would feel them hatch, one by one, filling his veins and his organs with thousands of microscopic, writhing children. Vance stroked Samuel's forehead gently, turned off the bright surgical lamp, leaving the room in a dim, suffocating shadow, and walked toward the heavy metal door. Before exiting, Vance paused, turned his head, and smiled warmly back at the paralyzed body lying in bed. 3. He told Samuel to sleep well, reminding him that he was never truly alone anymore. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing Ward 4B in complete silence save for the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the wet, squirming, sliding motion of the living thing slowly eating Samuel from the inside out. The air in the deep subterranean tunnels beneath St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was thick with the suffocating smell of damp concrete, rust, and old engine oil. Down here, far below the sterile white corridors of the emergency room, the humming vibration of the building's massive water boilers masked every other sound. Maintenance technician Silas knew every inch of these dark passages. To the hospital staff, he was just a quiet, pale man in grease-stained blue coveralls who fixed broken laundry chutes and replaced blown fuses in the middle of the night. Nobody questioned where Silas went during his 12-hour shifts. Nobody noticed that he had spent 3 years building a room that officially did not exist. Hidden behind a heavy steel access panel, in the back of the central oxygen storage vault lay Room 0. Silas had constructed it himself, lining the thick concrete walls with 3 layers of acoustic foam, heavy rubber matting, and soundproof industrial insulation. It was a vacuum of silence, so absolute that if you stood inside with the door sealed, you could hear the rush of blood sloshing through your own ears and the faint, wet clicking of your own eyelids closing. In the center of this pitch-black, silent box stood a heavy steel surgical table equipped with leather restraint straps, overhead infrared cameras, and a custom suspension rig holding an ultra-sensitive broadcast microphone worth tens of thousands of dollars. Silas believed with an absolute, terrifying conviction that the human voice possessed a secret divine frequency. It was a hidden pitch that only emerged at the precise moment a human being realized they were dying. A raw, pure sound produced when the brain sent its final, desperate burst of electrical energy into the vocal cords before total shutdown. Silas called it the death harmonic. He believed that if he could capture enough of these unique frequencies, mix them together, and cut them into custom vinyl records, listening to the resulting sound would grant him control over life and death itself. Every Tuesday night, Silas hunted. He didn't target young, healthy people who would be missed immediately. He targeted the quiet ones, elderly patients with no visiting family, terminal cases in the off-limits overnight recovery wards, and confused, heavily medicated individuals whose disappearance could easily be blamed on a sudden medical collapse or a confused, wander out of the building. Using a master key card and a stolen transport gurney covered in dirty laundry, Silas would slip into a room, press a rag soaked in odorless anesthetic over his victim's nose, and roll them down the service elevator straight into the depths of the hospital basement. On this hot July night, his subject was Clara, a 60-year-old former choir teacher who had been admitted for routine observation following a mild stroke. When Clara opened her eyes, she was not in her comfortable hospital bed. She was lying flat on her back, strapped securely to a cold, flat metal table inside pitch-black silence. So dense it felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't see her own hands. She couldn't see the ceiling. The air was ice-cold and tasted stale, dry, and metallic. Clara panicked, shifting her hips and straining against the thick leather cuffs around her wrists and ankles. The metal straps groaned slightly, but her body was pinned completely flat. She took a deep breath to cry out for a nurse, shouting with all the power left in her lungs, expecting her voice to echo down a long hallway, but the sound didn't travel. The moment her vocal cords vibrated, the dense acoustic walls of Room Zero swallowed the noise instantly. Her scream died in her mouth, flat and lifeless, stripped of all reverb, vanishing into the suffocating dark like a drop of water falling into an ocean of sand. A soft, mechanical click echoed in the darkness, and sudden, blinding red light filled the room as Silas switched on his night vision, equipment, and recording consoles. He stood inches away from Clara's head, wearing a black canvas apron, rubber boots, and a pair of bulky, professional noise-canceling headphones connected to the central microphone hovering just 3 inches above Clara's mouth. Silas's eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of empathy. He looked down at Clara not as a human being, but as a rare instrument waiting to be played. Silas reached down to a rolling metal cart beside the table and picked up his custom device. It was a terrifying mechanical contraption he had engineered using a heavy-duty hydraulic clamp, a modified medical neck brace, and a padded steel plate attached to a hand-cranked screw mechanism. Without saying a word, he pulled Clara's head forward and fitted the brace securely around her throat. Clara, thrashing violently, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, tears spilling down the sides of her face as she tried to pull her neck away from the cold metal. Silas worked with cold, mechanical efficiency, locking the brace into place so she couldn't move her head even a millimeter. Silas leaned down until his mouth was right next to Clara's ear. He didn't yell. He whispered in a low, gentle, almost loving tone, his breath cold against her wet cheek. He told her that she was going to help him complete his masterpiece. He explained that he was not going to cut her. He was not going to stab her, and he was not going to shoot her. Instead, he was going to turn the dial on his machine once every 10 minutes, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, narrowing her airway, crushing her windpipe with agonizing precision. He explained that the human body can fight against suffocation for hours if the air is taken away slowly enough, and during those hours, her lungs would attempt to force air through her collapsing throat, producing terrifying, unique vocal sounds that had never been recorded in human history. Silas put his headphones on, adjusted the gain control knobs on his mixing board, and touched the glowing red record button on his reel-to-reel tape deck. The magnetic tape began to spin with a quiet, hypnotic hiss. Silas placed his gloved hand on the steel hand crank attached to the neck brace, turned it one sharp notch to the right. A sickening, dull crunch sounded deep inside Clara's neck. The padded steel plate pressed inward, crushing her trachea just enough to reduce her air intake by 20%. Clara gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound tearing through her throat. Through his headphones, Silas heard the noise magnified 1,000 times, a wet, rattling, high-pitched whistling sound that vibrated with raw, animal panic. Silas closed his eyes, tilting his head back in pure ecstasy as his fingers danced across the equalizer knobs, adjusting the low-end frequencies to capture the deep, rattling vibration of her trembling vocal cords. 10 minutes passed in complete, agonizing silence. Clara's heart pounded violently against her ribs, sounding like a war drum inside her head. The lack of oxygen made her vision swim with bright red spots, but the terror kept her fully conscious. Every time she tried to exhale, her crushed airway produced a ragged wheezing sound. like wind blowing through a broken window pane. Silas sat motionless in a chair beside her, staring at the green digital sound wave bouncing rhythmically on his audio monitor screen. Then he turned the crank a second notch. Another muffled crack echoed in Clara's throat. Her airway was now closed by half. Clara began to suffocate in slow motion. Her diaphragm violently heaved against her abdomen, desperate for air, trying to drag oxygen into her burning lungs. She tried to scream a name, to utter a prayer, to cry out for help. But the sound that came out of her mouth was no longer human. It was a terrifying guttural rasp, a wet, scraping screech of cartilage, grinding together as her lungs tried to force air through, a gap no wider than the head of a pin. Silas leaned closer, moving the ultra-sensitive microphone until it was hovering directly over Clara's open, gasping lips. He could hear the tiny, microscopic bubbles of saliva popping inside her throat. He could hear the frantic flutter of her vocal folds tearing under the immense pressure of her desperate breathing. Silas smiled, a wide, hideous grin that stretched across his pale face. He reached out with a gloved finger and gently wiped a tear from the corner of Clara's eye, whispering into the dark that her voice was the most exquisite instrument he had ever played, that her terror was generating frequencies of pure, unadulterated beauty that would live forever on his vinyl records. For 4 excruciating hours, the nightmare continued in the pitch-black quiet of room 0. Silas turned the crank, millimeter by millimeter, expertly keeping Clara on the absolute razor's edge between life and death. He monitored her pulse, giving her tiny sips of water through a straw when her throat dried out, refusing to let her pass out, dragging out every agonizing second of her slow, suffocating descent into the dark. Every time her body spasmed in violent, involuntary shock, the microphone caught the sickening sound of her gasping, wheezing breath, recording every agonizing nuance onto the spinning reels of magnetic tape. By the 5th hour, Clara's body was spent. Her muscles had turned to lead. Her vision had faded into total darkness, and her organs were shutting down one by one from extreme hypoxia. She could no longer feel the cold steel table beneath her or the leather straps cutting into her wrists. The only thing left in her universe was the suffocating, heavy pressure on her throat and the terrifying, rhythmic sound of her own dying breaths echoing inside her head. Silas stood up from his chair. He looked at the audio levels on his console. The digital needles were peaking in the dark red zone. The ultimate frequency was approaching. He reached out and turned the hand crank one final full turn. A loud, distinct snap echoed inside Clara's neck as her airway collapsed completely. In her final, desperate second of life, as her brain released its massive terminal surge of energy, Clara made one last attempt to draw air into her crushed chest. Her vocal cords tightened to their absolute breaking point, producing a sound that was horrifyingly distinct, a high-pitched, warbling, glass-shattering screech that sounded half human and half siren, a chilling crescendo of pure, unadulterated, human agony that vibrated straight through the acoustic foam walls of the room. Silas held his breath, his hands trembling with dark euphoria as he watched the recording. Meters lock at maximum volume. The sound lasted for 5 long seconds before collapsing into a long, trailing wet rattle, followed by total, complete silence. Clara's body went limp against the metal table. Her wide, glassy eyes stared unblinking up into the dark. Silas stood still in the silence for a long time, listening to the absolute quiet of the room. Then he leaned down over Clara's lifeless face, reached up and pressed the stop button on his tape deck. The reels ceased spinning with a quiet metallic click. Silas took off his headphones, hung them carefully around his neck, and gently touched the cold, still cheek of the woman on the table. He leaned down close to her dead ear, his face inches from hers in the red light, and whispered into the endless, dark quiet of room 0 that her song was finished, and that tonight she would sing for him forever. The night shift at the St. Jude's Memorial Psychiatric and Neurological Rehabilitation Annex was notorious for its heavy, unsettling quiet. The corridors were lit only by dim, pale emergency strips that cast long, unnatural shadows across the polished floorboards. Patients here were broken in body and spirit, paralyzed from strokes, severely brain injured, or trapped in deep, twilight states of consciousness. Among the night staff, Nurse Elena was widely considered an absolute angel. She was quiet, impossibly gentle, and possessed a calm, soft voice that could instantly soothe the most agitated patient in the building. She volunteered for every late-night shift, every holiday, and every weekend. The doctors trusted her without question. They believed she was dedicated to the art of healing. They had no idea that Elena was an artist of a vastly different kind, and that her true passion lay in breaking the human mind until it shattered like glass. Elena didn't use crude violence to kill her victims. She didn't stab them in their sleep or suffocate them with pillows. Elena believed that the ultimate horror was not physical pain inflicted by a stranger, but forcing a human being to watch their own body commit horrific, irreversible self-destruction while their mind shrieked in absolute terror. Over 3 years of meticulous preparation, she had developed a specialized chemical compound, a odorless, clear fluid she mixed into the intravenous drip bags of selected patients. The cocktail combined high-dose dissociation drugs, extreme sensory enhancers, and a powerful synthetic nerve agent that completely bypassed the brain's conscious willpower while leaving the motor pathways completely responsive to external, hypnotic commands. On a rainy Tuesday night, when the rest of the staff was distracted by a minor emergency on the 3rd floor, Elena went to work in the sub-basement therapy room. The room was a forgotten storage space beneath the old wing of the hospital, soundproofed by feet of solid earth and thick brick walls. In the center of the room sat a heavy oak chair equipped with thick leather arm restraints directly facing a massive full-length mirror set in a silver frame. The mirror was lit by 2 searingly bright, white surgical floodlights mounted on heavy tripods, casting zero shadows and ensuring that anyone sitting in the chair was forced to look at every tiny detail of their own reflection. Her chosen patient for the night was David, a 42-year-old, former construction foreman recovering from a severe spinal trauma that had left him temporarily bedridden. David was a physically powerful man, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and rough, calloused hands. To the outside world, David had simply slipped into a sudden, unexplained nighttime coma. In reality, he was sitting bound to the heavy wooden chair in the sub-basement room, his heart pounding violently against his ribs, while Elena leaned over his shoulder, adjusting his posture in front of the blindingly bright mirror. David was not asleep. He was trapped in the most terrifying state of consciousness known to human science. The chemical mixture flowing through his bloodstream had completely severed his conscious mind's control over his muscles. He could not turn his head. He could not close his eyelids, which Elena had carefully held open with clear, soft gel strips to prevent him from blinking. He could not scream, nor could he make his tongue move inside his mouth. Yet his mind was razor-sharp, hyper-aware and screaming in raw, unadulterated panic. His vision was crystalline, magnifying every single crease of skin, every vein, and every terrified flicker of his own eyes in the massive silver mirror right in front of him. Elena stood directly behind David's chair, visible in the mirror. She wore a pristine, spotless white nurse's uniform, her hair neatly pinned back in a tight bun. She leaned down close to David's right ear, her soft, warm breath brushing against his earlobe. She spoke in a gentle, melodic whisper, a hypnotic rhythm she had spent years perfecting. She told David that tonight he was going to perform a masterpiece of self-surgery. She explained that his body no longer belonged to his brain. His hands were now puppets, and she held the invisible strings. David tried with every ounce of his soul to fight the paralysis, to kick the table, to break the chair, to shut his eyes, but his body remained completely, terrifyingly still. The reflection in the mirror stared right back at him, a strong, terrified man pinned under bright lights. Staring at his own pale face, Elena reached down to a stainless steel tray sitting beside the chair. On it lay an assortment of razor-sharp surgical tools, curved scalpels, heavy bone clamps, silver tweezers, and long, gleaming needles threaded with black suture line. Instead of picking up a tool to use on David, Elena gently took David's right hand. His hand felt cold, but as Elena massaged his fingers, applying light pressure to specific nerve clusters on his wrist. While speaking in her low, rhythmic voice, a sickening shift occurred deep within David's nervous system. Elena picked up a heavy, steel-handled scalpel with a fresh number 11 blade. She slid the handle directly into David's right hand, curling his thick, calloused fingers firmly around the steel. David watched in the mirror as his own hand closed tightly around the knife. Panic surged through his brain like a tidal wave of molten iron. No, no, please, stop. Move your fingers, drop it, drop it. His mind screamed, begging his hand to open, begging his fingers to uncurl and let the deadly piece of metal fall to the concrete floor. Instead, under the terrifying influence of Elena's hypnotic chemical control, David's right arm lifted slowly into the air. David watched in absolute, horror-stricken fascination as his own arm rose with mechanical precision. Holding the gleaming scalpel steady in the harsh white light, his hand didn't shake. His grip was firm, strong, and completely detached from his conscious willpower. Elena stood right behind him in the mirror, resting her chin lightly on his shoulder, her eyes wide and glittering with dark, intense pleasure as she whispered the next instruction into his ear. She told David that his skin was a veil, a lie that was keeping the real him trapped inside, and that his hand was going to set him free. David watched his reflection as his own right hand moved the sharp tip of the scalpel directly toward his own throat. The cold, razor-sharp steel pressed gently against the soft skin right above his left carotid artery. The sensation was terrifyingly real. He could feel the coldness of the blade, the tiny bite of the metal piercing the top layer of his skin, a single bead of warm, bright red blood welling up and running down his neck. His mind was shrieking, thrashing against the invisible walls of his paralyzed skull, begging for a miracle, praying for someone to walk through the door, for the floor to collapse, for anything to stop the nightmare. With a smooth, terrifyingly steady motion, David's own hand drew the scalpel across his throat, slicing through skin and subcutaneous fat in a neat, straight 3-inch line. The pain was immediate, sharp, and blinding, but the chemical cocktail in his blood altered his perception of the pain, making it feel hyper-real, agonizingly detailed, yet completely uncoupled from his body's natural reflex to pull away. He couldn't flinch. He couldn't jerk his head back. He was forced to sit completely still, staring into his own wide, tear-filled eyes in the mirror as his own hand sliced his flesh open. Blood began to pour down his neck, soaking into the collar of his hospital gown, turning the white fabric into a dark, heavy red. Elena let out a soft, delighted sigh behind him. She whispered that he was doing wonderfully, praising his precision, calling him her most gifted student. She reached down, took his left hand, and lifted it up into the light. She picked up a pair of silver surgical retractors from the metal tray and placed them in his left hand. Under her calm, whispering command, David's left hand rose to join his right. He watched in the mirror as his own left hand inserted the metal hooks of the retractors directly into the fresh wound on his neck, pulling the edges of his own skin apart to reveal the pulsing red muscle and white connective tissue beneath. His right hand, still holding the scalpel, reached inside the opened wound, the tip of the blade hovering millimeters away from his pulsing jugular vein. The psychological agony was beyond anything a human brain was designed to endure. To sit in complete silence, fully conscious, watching your own hand systematically dismantle your own body like a cold, emotionless stranger shattered David's sanity into 1,000 jagged fragments. Tears poured continuously from his pinned-open eyes, blurring his vision for a fraction of a second, before Elena gently wiped them away with a tissue so he wouldn't miss a single detail of his own. Destruction in the reflection. Elena leaned in even closer, her cheek touching his wet skin, her voice dropping to an intoxicating, dangerous whisper. She told him that it was time for the final beautiful act. She told him to look deep into his own eyes in the mirror, to lock gaze with his reflection, and not to look away for even a fraction of a second. David stared into the mirror. His face was pale, covered in a cold sweat, his neck a bloody ruin held open by his own left hand. He looked into his own wide, terrified blue eyes, the eyes of a man who was watching himself die by his own hands. Elena whispered the final command. David's right hand rotated the scalpel in his grip, turning the razor-sharp edge inward toward his main artery. With a quick, powerful, deliberate push, his own hand plunged the blade deep into his neck, severing the vessel cleanly. A heavy, dark arterial spray hit the surface of the silver mirror, obscuring the center of the reflection in a thick, warm sheet of deep crimson blood. David felt the warm rush of life pouring out of his body, spilling over his chest, his lap, and his hands. His vision began to darken at the edges, the bright white floodlights fading into a hazy, shimmering gray. Yet, even as his blood pressure plummeted to zero and his brain began to shut down from severe blood loss, his hands remained frozen in place, holding the wound open, holding the knife deep inside his own flesh until the very last drop of blood drained out of him. Elena stood watching the blood drip down the face of the mirror, her reflection obscured by the red stain. She reached out, gently pulled the scalpel from David's limp, lifeless fingers and set it back on the tray. She unclasped the gel strips from his eyelids, allowing his dead, glassy eyes to partially close at last. Elena leaned down, her lips almost touching the cold, blood-stained ear of the dead man sitting in a chair. She smiled at the bloody mirror, smoothed down her clean white uniform, and whispered into the absolute silence of the sub-basement room that he had done an incredible job, that he was finally free, and that it was time to clean the mirror for the next patient waiting upstairs.